Created with free version for non-commercial use.
Hi guys, and a very warm welcome along to this video series on mastering with FabFilter plugins. Now, I love the FabFilter plugin suite and I've been using it for years on every single one of my productions and mixdowns and masters. So I'm really excited to be sharing my knowledge on how you can use this amazing suite of plugins within the context of mastering. Now, I actually work as a mastering engineer as well as being an artist myself. So I produce music as Get To Know. You can check my music out there. And I'm also the mastering engineer for one of the world's biggest independent dance music record labels, CR2 Records. And through my work for CR2, I've mastered artists like Eat Everything, Carl Cox, Lindstrom. And also recently I've been working with more guitar-based bands such as the Australian band Pira. So that's a little introduction to myself. And now let's crack on with our first video, which is how we can use Pro-Q3 to musically rebalance a track that we are mastering. Now, the first track we have is by Stranded on a Planet, and it's called Waiting Out My Time in Richmond. It's a really nice kind of country style track. I'll give you a little blast of how it sounds. This is a pre-master.
I'm waiting out my time in Richmond. You won't find a trace of me when I am heading north.
There you go. So this track has been given to Groove 3 to use in this video series. So thanks a lot to Stranded on a Planet for allowing us to use the track. Now the first thing I'm going to do is load up Pro-Q3. Now Pro-Q3 is the flagship EQ from FabFilter. And for me, it's my kind of desert island EQ. You know, it's my go-to EQ that I use on every single production, every single mix. And if I could, as I said, Desert Island EQ, if I could choose one EQ, it would be this one because it's so versatile and it covers so many different applications. Now, before we get into the actual EQ side of things and applying this, let's just talk a little bit about the mastering process itself. Well, when we're mastering a track, we're looking to take it from the final mix stage to the stage where it's ready to kind of go out into the world and be consumed. Be that on Spotify, in clubs, on the radio, at festivals, basically whatever the function is of that piece of music, the mastering needs to make sure that it's ready for that platform. Now, ideally, mastering allows you to create a final master which is best suited to cross over anywhere where the music's going to be played. If it's going to be played on a small kind of mono speaker in your local supermarket, it's going to sound as good as it can do on that speaker and as good as the other tracks that are going to be played. And then if it's getting played in a very high-end sound system somewhere, it's going to sound great as well. So that's what you're going for with mastering is translatability across different listening platforms. Now, what we're also going for is taking the vision of the mix and making it the best version of itself or helping build on the vision of the person that's produced or mixed a track. Now, for a lot of people watching this video series, that's going to be you, and you're going to be the person who's working on every single stage of the track. For me, for my Get To Know project, 99.9% of the time, I'm mixing it and I'm mastering it as well. So what we're trying to do is basically just add that final little polish to the vision that we've already created with our mixdown. And what that is going to entail a lot of time is trying to create the separation within the mix, which means that the mix feels like it moves beyond the confines of the speakers. So if you're sitting in your studio and you have your speakers in front of you, what you're trying to go for a lot of the time is to have a mix which sounds like the high frequencies are above the speakers and the low frequencies are below the speakers and the left and the right is very wide. This obviously slightly changes depending on the genre, but I'd say it's kind of universal, although maybe slightly changes across different genres. But generally you're going for a mix which, as I said, escapes the confines of the speakers, feels larger than the speakers, doesn't feel boxed in. And especially with EQ, that's what we're trying to go for, is to enhance the ability of the track to kind of beat the confines of the speakers. Okay, so without further ado, let's actually dive in and have a look at a practical application of this. Now, this is not going to be a Pro-Q3 explained video series. And if you want more of a kind of feature by feature explanation of these plugins, I suggest you check out the explained series on Groove 3. This is going to be more kind of in the trenches, actually taking tracks to be kind of final masters using this plugin suite. Now, I'm not going to do a full master in each video on every track. I'm basically going to show the tools that we have at our disposal and how we can use them on different track examples. And then towards the end of the video series, we're actually going to take these tracks that we're going to be using and we're going to do masters start to finish using the FabFilter tools. But for this first video, as I said, we're going to be focusing on EQ. The EQ we're going to approach in different stages. So this first video is going to be more of a kind of nuts and bolts approach to rebalancing a track using some different filter types. And then as the video progresses, we're going to be having a look at some more kind of advanced applications of Pro-Q3. But as I said, for this first video, we're going to look at more of a bread and butter kind of approach. Okay, so the first thing we have to really do is try to identify what needs to be done on the track. So let's find a portion of the track which has a lot going on. Often that's the kind of last chorus on this kind of song where a lot of things are going to be playing. Now we have a great analyzer within Pro-Q3 which shows us the frequency spectrum. Let's just bring it back to where the beats come in.
This is my last night in Richmond. Hope she will look after you, lead you to a better. This is my last night in Richmond.
Okay, so that gives us an idea of what we're working with. So the first port of call when it comes to EQ is actually to make sure we're working in the right EQ mode. Now for mastering, I would say that's going to be the linear phase mode. Now there's different options we can choose from here. I would go for the maximum linear phase mode. Now what is linear phase mode versus the zero latency mode and the natural phase mode? Well, the linear phase mode means that we're not going to be introducing any phase distortion within the signal. Now, you may be thinking that's always going to be better, so why don't we just always have linear phase mode on? Well, it does introduce a latency. Now, when we're just mastering a track and we're using just a stereo file, the latency is going to be less of an issue because we're actually only working on one single file. But obviously in a mixed context, having latency introduced can be a little bit more problematic depending on how your DAW deals with latency. And also obviously for recording, it can be a big problem. And actually for a lot of applications, the zero latency mode is perfectly reasonable to use. And actually, in some extreme cases, when you're using quite steep EQ curves, especially on low frequency sounds, actually linear phase mode can be worse because it can introduce what's called pre-ringing, which can smear the transients of sounds. But as a general rule of thumb, for complex material, so whenever you're summing together two kind of correlated parts, like a top-bottom snare drum mic, for example, or bass that's been DI'd and bass that's been amped, things like that, generally you're going to want to use linear phase mode. Whereas if you're just working with individual parts, majority of the time, zero latency is going to be fine. Now, the natural phase mode is actually more of an analog style phase mode. So I would try in the mix context, just A and B between these two and see if you can hear any difference on which one sounds better and go with that. But for mastering, we're going to be using linear phase. Now, the first thing we're going to do is a kind of top tail here, which means we're going to roll off some of the very low frequencies and some of the very high frequencies. Now, why are we going to do this? Well, the very low frequencies, kind of below this kind of 20 to 30 hertz mark, they actually take up quite a lot of energy because for us to be able to hear them, they have to be quite loud because our ears are not very effective at actually hearing these frequencies. Our sensitivity to sound increases as we get into this kind of pain zone of 1 to 3K, and then it kind of rolls off at the highs and the lows. So to actually hear the lows, they have to have so much more energy. And when we get down to here, the older we get, the less likely we can actually hear those frequencies full stop. So it's not a particularly efficient use of your overall frequency spectrum and your overall volume headroom to allow these very low and very high frequencies to kind of remain in there. So what we can do is do a little top tail. Now we can choose different slopes here. The more gradual the slope, the more musical it's going to be. So if we start to get into the kind of brick wall territory down here, it's really not very musical. So you want to stick to these kind of more smooth slopes, I'd say. Now, what you'll find is, and what you're listening for when you bring this in, is that actually taking away these really low frequencies allows the speakers to more efficiently reproduce all of the frequencies that go up. So it has a kind of a ripple effect up through the frequency spectrum, meaning that the mid-range and the higher frequencies are then kind of reproduced more efficiently. So it will just kind of clean up the sound and tighten it up a little bit. So let's kind of bring this in and out and see if we can hear the difference. Now, it's not night and day a lot of the time, but it's there usually. This is a bypass button here.
This is my last night in Richmond. Hope she will look after you, lead you to a better. This is my last night in Richmond. Hope she will look to a better places. Night last night in Richmond. I hope she will look after you.
So it's just ever so slightly more focused with that cut in there. As I said, it's subtle, but it's definitely there. Now, you don't want to go too high here because you actually start taking away frequencies that you kind of want, and it starts to have an audible effect.
This is night last night in Richmond. I hope she will look after you. Lead you to a...
Now, using the pre and post analyzer, we can see that we're taking away some of those very low frequencies there. Now, we can do the same thing on the top as well. Now, this means we're not going to be allowing the track to have frequencies that are really getting to be out of our kind of hearing range, essentially.
This is night last night in Richmond. I hope she will look after you.
Now, the same rules apply, so the more steep the slope, the less musical it's going to be.
This is night last night in Richmond. I hope she will look after you. Lead you to a better. This is night last night in Richmond. I hope she will look after you. Lead you to a better. This is night last night in Richmond. I hope she will look after you. Lead you to a better. This is night last night in Richmond. I hope she will look after you. Lead you to a...
So as I said, it's subtle, but it's definitely better. It's tighter, it's kind of cleaner, and it's just a little bit more focused. Okay, so the next thing we could try here, let me just go to an earlier part of the track. In some parts of the track, it feels like the vocals are actually a little bit quiet. So something we could actually try, again, as a kind of rebalancing tool, is using what's called a tilt shelf. So I'll select tilt shelf from my options here, and now we can actually choose to balance either side of the kind of tilt point here differently. So we could kind of roll off the lows and boost the highs, or vice versa. So if we try and kind of pivot around the vocal, it might help us to just kind of tame some of these lower muddy frequencies and actually bring the vocal out a little bit.
You won't find a trace of me when I am headed north. You won't find a trace of me when I am headed north. You won't find a trace of me when I am headed north. You won't find a trace of me.
So it just adds a little bit more presence to the voice. Now, when we're EQing on a master, a little goes a very, very long way. And actually, to kind of reflect that, we could change our scale here to be 3 dB, which means that now this kind of 0.91 dB boost and cut, we have a more resolution to be able to view it. But really, you don't necessarily have to go above a dB of boosts and cuts with the EQ to actually get what you're looking for with the master. And generally, if you're doing big cuts and boosts in mastering, there's something wrong in the mix that needs addressing. So that's helping us kind of bring the vocal out a little bit, I would say.
You won't find a trace of me when I am headed north. You won't find a trace.
Take it a bit higher. And it's also helping just to kind of remove a little bit of the bottom heaviness of the mix. Okay, so that's our first video on using Pro-Q3 to rebalance the track. So just to recap, we've done a low cut and a high cut here just to allow the speakers to really efficiently reproduce all the frequencies in the mid-range, which our ears are much better at hearing anyway. So these very low frequencies below 20, obviously 20 is the limit of our hearing anyway. So below there, we're really talking about inaudible frequencies that are just taking up needless energy. Same with the high frequencies. And then we've done this little tilt shelf just to try and bring out the vocal a little bit more. So in the next video, we're going to carry on this approach to rebalancing the track to try and make it sound as good as possible in terms of the frequency spectrum. So I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.
Created with free version for non-commercial use.